Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first session of our multi-part KCS series. Today, we'll be discussing what KCS is and how it is different. My name is Tabitha Ishman, and I'm the Marketing Manager of Excalibur Data Systems. And I just wanted to welcome all of you to our webinar today and then talk about a few logistics before we go ahead and get started. The lines are muted and the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be sent via email to everyone on the line tomorrow, and we'll answer questions at the end in a Q&A session. And you can ask questions at any time during the presentation just by typing them into the question window. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Excalibur Data Systems. We are a leading edge consulting firm guiding organizations through their digital transformation journey. You can learn more about Excalibur by visiting our website at www.excaliburdata.com. So before we get started, I also wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of the next two webinars in the series. On December 3rd, we will be diving into the KCS principles, and then on the 17th of December, we will be discussing KCS practices and techniques. We also will have more dates in 2021 to extend the KCS series, but you can register by visiting www.excaliburdata.com/upcoming events. It's on the screen there for you to see. And so to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Mike Fuson, VP and Senior Solution Architect of Excalibur Data Systems, and Jonathan Berdyck, also a Senior Solution Architect at Excalibur Data Systems. So welcome.
Thank you, Tabitha. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Tabitha said, I'm Mike Fuson, one of the Senior Solution Architects here at Excalibur and also a certified KCS practitioner. And I have with me my colleague, Jonathan Berdyck, another of the Senior Solution Architects here at Excalibur, and also a certified KCS practitioner. And we're looking forward to sharing kind of this first part in this multi-part series to develop your understanding of KCS and how it is different. Jonathan, a few words from you.
Thanks, Mike. Well, we appreciate you joining us today. We're really looking forward to sharing this content with you. We are really excited about knowledge-centered services and how it's different from kind of the typical way that we manage knowledge. And we really feel like there's a lot of benefits and a lot of positives to it. And we hope that you see that the same way after this, not only this session, but the subsequent sessions as well. So appreciate it.
So what's in store for us today? So we're going to talk about what is knowledge anyway, the typical knowledge practices as we know them today, and then what is KCS and how is it different, and what's in it for me and for you, and some basics on KCS, which will lay kind of the foundation for the additional webinars as we dive deeper into those concepts. So we've got a poll for everyone, and we wanted to ask, are you familiar with the concepts of knowledge-centered service? Tabitha, can you throw that poll up for us? So are you very familiar? You're somewhat familiar? You know how to spell it? Or maybe you thought it was a dish that was served at KFC. All right, excellent, Tabitha. So we've got someone who's some folks that are very familiar with it, and some folks that know how to spell it. So hopefully we'll be able to enlighten you a little bit. I'm going to turn things over to Jonathan, and Jonathan's going to get us started with first things first.
All right, thanks, Mike. So when we think about knowledge, I think a lot of us I think most of us believe that ignorance is not necessarily bliss, especially when it comes to an enterprise process and a way that we operate as an organization. But it's important to really understand what we're going for and what we mean by this. I think we can characterize knowledge in a general point of view as information on which we can act. And we often hear knowledge used in the kind of the typical stack of data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, ultimately getting to, knowledge maybe is more of the how, and the wisdom is sort of maybe the why of that. And we see that in various more formal documentation spaces like the ITIL foundations and those practices, things like that. In the context of KCS, we are going to work with knowledge as a byproduct of interacting with others. And that's predominantly going to come in the context of people needing something from us, all right? And that is actually one of the things that we're going to talk about in more detail even today as one of the features that sets the KCS methodology apart from how we typically might attack knowledge management in our environment. Then lastly, knowledge typically will evolve a little bit over time, although I would imagine that at least in the initial stages of the compilation, if you were to picture a graph, we might have much of that compilation going on in the beginning and perhaps leveling out over time. But we still want to make sure that even if no matter how maybe small the change in what we know is, that as long as we deem it valuable to the content and to the context, that we want to be able to go ahead and document that. So in order to really provide a distinct picture of how KCS is different, it's really important to really see the other side of it, right? So we have some information here of really characteristics of maybe typical knowledge management practices. I wouldn't want to say that this is a generalization across every organization that's ever tried to do knowledge management or is working in this capacity, but I think that you will see or maybe even identify with various bullet points here over the next couple of slides, where maybe you'd say, yeah, I see how that is a feature of something that your organization is doing now, and I can actually see, perhaps by the end of our time today, how that might not be as valuable or as effective as the KCS methodology. So one of the biggest things, and it's actually not even on the slides here, but knowledge management as a process. In particular, I think of version 3 of ITIL is part of the service transition space. It's not particularly emphasized so much in more of an operational and on-demand exercise. So I think that even from the outset, there's perhaps even some misconceptions about where knowledge fits in to the overall schema when we're thinking about incident management and change and release and those sorts of things. So I think that ultimately sets knowledge management up as a process to sort of instigate some of these different features. For instance, the fact that oftentimes we'll see that knowledge is not really driven from demand, but rather it's driven from the need for us to feel like, as service providers, that everything we know is valuable. Okay, and because everything that we know is valuable, somebody might need to know it at some point, and so we better document it, right? But ultimately, what we're leading to there is concentrating on a much broader set of targets than we actually really need to do. So this is what is typically called just in case. So I'm going to do this just in case. I'm going to document all of these things just in case we need it. But actually, the Consortium for Service Innovation, the organization that really manages the KCS methodology, would really espouses that the vast vast majority of knowledge that is gathered in this kind of capacity is not actually as valuable or useful as we believe it is. Okay. The other things that come out of this are that we often see more of an activity-based orientation in this process versus outcomes. So oftentimes this manifests itself by gamifying the creation of content in our environment so that we can show some progress, perhaps from a management standpoint. And so we are quantifying our activity. I've created 5 knowledge articles this month, so I'll get a good solid check mark on my next review. But we're not completely sure really how valuable that information is or whether anybody will use it. Go on to the next slide, Mike. The other things that we see are that the process is often very bureaucratic. And I mean that in a couple of different ways here. So one, it's single threaded in the sense that we might have a single individual that is creating the content and managing it through its entire life cycle. But then we often have a funnel or a bit of an impediment to the publication process by pushing the content through an approval group, maybe one or more people that review the content and then decide whether or not it's got what it needs to be published for either internal or even external consumption. The other part of that is that what we end up with in these cases oftentimes is what I like to call the grand knowledge review, where we designate an article or all of our articles to be reviewed on some future periodic basis. Maybe we want to make sure that our content is still valid 6 months from now or a year from now. But if we were to do that for even a couple of hundred articles, we would be doing that work on a very repetitive basis. And we are performing that work potentially on content that might not even be totally useful to everybody. The other thing that sometimes we see is that the process is separate from our typical workflow. And I think about what I just said earlier about where kind of historically knowledge management has been sourced from a service transition point of view. And there is an element of operational components when you're looking at some of the ways that knowledge has transitioned through ITIL framework thought. But still, what we end up with is a process that sometimes is just totally separate. It's tied in loosely with the other work that we're doing, but it's exercised in a separate fashion. And so therefore, it almost seems like it's an add-on to the typical day-to-day work that we're doing. Then the last 3 pieces here really are oriented toward the actual content and the way that the article looks and feels. So, you know, I have a personal tendency to maybe be a little overly detailed with things, but I know that with some knowledge elements, we just don't have to be as verbose. So we end up spending a lot of time attempting to be very wordy about something when we don't actually really need to be that wordy about the content. The other thing is there is sometimes an overemphasis on the way that it looks. And you will see this in particular where technology has not really, where there's sort of a low technology maturity within an organization, specifically around knowledge. So it's much more of an ad hoc kind of process, and so therefore we're using things like word processing and spreadsheets and other kinds of sources in order to perform that documentation. And so we get sort of pulled into this, oh, I got to make it look good, I got to do this, got to have the fonts right and all that. And so that's a time, that's an element that makes us much more inefficient on the work that we do. Then lastly here, and probably one of the more important pieces, is that oftentimes the content of these articles lacks the customer's point of view. In an environment where we are driven by activity and we're not driven by the outcome, we probably have a tendency to perform a lot of that content creation ourselves, separate from the people who need it and separate from the input that they might provide us in creating good content. And so when we lack the customer point of view, we are not really doing ourselves any favors, and certainly we're not doing our customers or our end users any favors, because they're the ones who are consuming it for the most part. And if they don't understand or they don't speak the same language that we do, so to speak, then they are not going to find what they're looking for, or it's going to take them a lot longer to find what they're looking for. So the verdict here is that many times we'll end up with a lot of extra material, end up with an enormous amount of content, and it all looks good and it feels good that we created it, but maybe our customers can't use it, or our customers don't understand it, or they can't find it. We end up in a situation where we might not be able to manage it as well as we would like. And so then things get stale, a lot of extra content that we don't need. We end up getting overwhelmed with our own process of how to generate this and maintain it. The process is often a sidecar, as I call it. It's just, we are doing it when we have time. We're not doing it in the course of our typical workday, and it lacks purpose in the work. And at the risk of sort of getting overly philosophical, but I think all of us want purpose in the work that we do and in what we create. And the enterprise is really no exception to that. We want to feel like we're making a valuable contribution to things, that our work, that the content is useful to somebody, but oftentimes that we're just doing a lot of work without getting a whole lot of return on that. So, our energy expenditure is very high. Maybe our results are not exactly in line with that. And we think there's a better way to do that.
Yeah, Jonathan, one of the things that we talk about a lot, Jonathan and I had the opportunity to become certified KCS practitioners, and you go into training to learn this new way of doing things. And it was interesting because I had to think over the last 20 plus years that I've been working in IT environments, knowledge is a process, is done a particular way, and so many of us do it in that method. We are creating a knowledge article based on the resolution to an issue, and we think, hey, other people may run into this issue, let's create that article. And then it goes through some sort of process of which to be evaluated. SMEs might look at it, technical writers to rewrite it, and then eventually it gets approved and is able to be consumed. And I think that's great, right? That process has worked to a degree, but it is very laborious. And Then you get into that review process of, well, we need to review these articles, make sure they're still accurate and appropriate, and have the right information. And you start to look at things like how often do certain articles get used, and some articles aren't getting used at all. But this is a process that we've all learned, and there is a different way, as we learned in going into this KCS journey. There's a very, very different way to do that. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about this different way.
Sure. So the KCS methodology, as we'll see, is really based in creating a much more inline, collaborative, on-demand experience, at least from the transactional point of view. So it is based and sourced in principles, and we'll see core concepts, the practices, and our techniques in knowledge for being able to create and maintain the knowledge in an environment that is as efficient as we can be. And you'll see that we still have plenty of opportunities to create content, reuse it, and improve it through the actual methodology itself, but it's a much more collaborative and inline way of doing that. We are going to see, though, that this is going to require a little bit of change in how we think, how we approach the work that we intend to accomplish, and how we think about this work in the context of our entire sort of integrated workload that we tackle on a day-to-day basis. So if you were to read through the KCS methodology, you can get to it online. Actually, the first time I ever read it, I thought, I really like how much this makes sense. It just felt like it fit well, it was logically laid out, and it's well explained by the Consortium for Service Innovation. I think the thought process, though, in how we deal with this, and in particular how we work with it in the context of everything else, much more difficult. Which is not really, that probably won't surprise any of you. Change can be very hard for certain organizations, for certain people. And so thinking about something a little bit differently compared to kind of, quote, the way we've always done it can be somewhat difficult to really come up with. One of the big things about knowledge is that it's not a zero-sum game. And if you are not familiar with a zero-sum game, these are games where in order for one person or an entity to gain something, somebody else has to give up an equal amount of that or a reciprocal amount of whatever it is. But knowledge doesn't really work that way. I mean, if I have something that I know and I share it with Mike or vice versa, then now we both have it. And when we both have it, then we both come up with, we have some different perspectives on things. We can contribute that content or to that content in a much more meaningful way. And that's just between two people. If I do that, or if our organization does that over multiple times with many different people, we have the potential to really ramp this up and make it something that's very comprehensive. So thinking about this, we need to change the way that we just think about how not only we, but our organization functions. So going from a sort of me interpretation of of managing knowledge content to us, looking at this as a way to create value rather than just logging a particular activity. Taking on the idea that this is going to change, we're going to continuously improve this versus just saying, all right, well, we got that done and I can check that off the list. Being collaborative about the work that we do rather than sort of the classic escalation of things where I just sort of hand it off to somebody else and then I don't have anything else to do with that. Context, very important. Otherwise, I think we lose the reason why we do this work in the first place versus just creating content. And then ultimately just being able to learn and share versus me just knowing something and maybe protecting my turf because I like the fact that I know this and nobody else does and I don't want to share it. But that's not really beneficial. It might be beneficial in the short term to an individual, but a long term, I think it's detrimental to an individual and it's detrimental to an organization. So you're probably thinking, well, okay, so what is it? What's in this for me or you, and what's in it for my organization? And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is an exhaustive list, but I think that if we were to just kind of boil this down a good bit, we can see that there is a benefit from an individual standpoint and how you participate in your organization, from an achievement and a recognition and the actual work. KCS, I think, does sort of support this idea of not only, of course, collective results, but you, just by design, it has autonomy and a role progression in your organization, just sheerly by the way that it is set up to do. Your recognition would be based on your on the contribution that you're making, but not necessarily from a content point of view all the time, but helping to actually achieve a particular outcome. And we can understand that we are mastering the standard. We're mastering the way that this methodology is going to work in our environment. So that contributes over and over and over to, in my perspective, a much more engaging way to work and to contribute to my organization. From an organization perspective, quicker solutions, we are trying to, most of, many organizations, the service arm of organizations really has a vested interest in providing information that as quickly and as accurately as we can. We all benefit from that. But organizations also benefit from using our time as best as we can, as a group and individually. And so the ability to optimize that is a big deal. And then finally, fostering some organizational learning. And it's interesting that, like, some of these things you think would be, they seem obvious, and yet I think that over time they come more difficult. It's more difficult for us as individuals and as organizations to foster this in a way that's meaningful. So let's take a look now at some of the basic foundational elements of the KCS methodology. Okay, the methodology is really based in these four different pieces. It's based in these principles and core concepts, practices, and the techniques that we utilize within the course of the methodology. So the principles and core concepts, these would be the baseline pieces that really are they're non-negotiable for us from a methodology standpoint. Ignoring these things would really, they would defeat the purpose. They would defeat the why we would do this. The practices we will see, we'll introduce those today. We'll get into those in more detail as in subsequent sessions. But these are the prescriptive elements. These are the big methods and the work cycles within the methodology itself. And then those techniques, these are the pieces and parts, both mechanically and sort of ergonomically, that fit into our workflow, as we work on a day-to-day basis. So they're all meshed together, whether you work backwards in this list or you work forward in the list. Everything is really is designed to fit together in a way where the techniques really do depend on having a solid grasp of the practices that we're going to institute, and in a similar fashion, the practices really depend on our core concepts, what we believe, and how we set up our principles in the organization. So let's talk about these principles as the first step. We've got really 4 basic places where that make up the foundation of this: abundance, creating value, trust, and being demand driven. So we've talked a little bit about this already, that knowledge is not a zero-sum game. We have knowledge in abundance in every organization that ever exists. There is enough to go around, and it's actually better that it does. And we all know this, I think. I really believe this, but it's because it's just kind of hard to change our behavior. We struggle with this idea that sharing content and sharing ideas amongst ourselves is not going to be a detriment to ourselves individually, right? The second piece is the value proposition. We want to be able to drive not an individual level of execution and experience, but a much more collaborative way to do that, so that it supports this idea of the abundance. There's much to go around, and we benefit from everybody telling one another and helping one another along in that regard. And it should be said in that value proposition that KCS is not, it's not taking the place of other kinds of documentation that we would often track, such as policies or technical documents or system specifications, or maybe even particular articles that we publish for very prescriptive reasons. We'll talk about those in subsequent session. But it all goes into creating, a bigger value proposition. Trust is a big one. Oftentimes, organizations kind of create process out of a position of what do we trust the least in our environment, and how do we manage to it? And what that leads us to is a very constrained and I think somewhat shallow way of looking at the way we do work. And we miss out on a bunch of things by having a lack of trust. Now, trust is needs to exist kind of at all levels, which is not really something that's so surprising in some sort of organizational change initiative. We have to have leadership that says we see the value in this and we support it. but we also have to have those other layers of trust in other parts of the organization. We have to trust, as an example, that the process works well as designed and it is as effective as it can be. And we also have to trust that the roles that we play in the organization as part of the methodology, that we are functioning almost pretty much at an individual level in a trustworthy fashion. And a very practical component of that is simply I'm trusting, or people are trusting me, that when I publish content to the knowledge base, that we've done everything that we can, at least to this point, with what we know, to make that as valuable and as accurate as possible. Then finally, here we have demand driven. When we introduced some of the ideas around a typical environment, there is this idea of just in case. You know, if I create all these knowledge articles, then I'll be covered, and so will you, and we'll just document everything we know. But the KCS methodology is the exact opposite in probably 99% of the cases, where we, instead of creating stuff just in case, we are creating things just in time. All right, we are creating things when they are demanded of us, such that we know immediately that if it was worth reporting and worth requesting from a customer point of view, it's worth documenting on our part. And so we know that at least one person or one group finds that information valuable, and so therefore it's worth documenting. So in this case, some things around this idea of proactivity, and being proactive is good in many places, but this is one of those areas where being proactive just might bite us a little bit. Maybe not a lot, but maybe enough to let us know that that work was not as valuable as we had made it out to be. With those pieces out of the way, now we have the core concepts. Okay. Now we've compartmentalized these a little between what we would consider maybe the more generalized concepts or ideas of the methodology versus the more practical elements of it. So when we look at the abstract pieces, we're looking at the ability to not only continuously improve, but to transform the way we do work. We need buy-in at all levels, and our leadership is required. And those two elements aren't a whole lot different than maybe any other organizational change initiative. We always need leadership on this stuff, and we need people to support the way that we're going to do work, so that it can be defended and it can be pushed forward in an environment. Often though, we don't, in many cases, maybe we don't have champions of the way that we do the work. So we are always working within KCS as part of one of the roles that people play in the organization is to coach other individuals along for the purpose of improving everyone around us. And so we want to continually coach for success. That's an actual formal concept there that KCS espouses. And then finally, assessing the value of what we're doing, both from a process point of view and from a content context point of view. Now, from a working standpoint, some of the more practical ways that we see these core concepts play out are the collective experience. So we're sharing and we're driving these pieces together as a group. The collective ownership. Okay, this is not all about just one subject matter expert who came up with the content, got it approved, published it, reviewed it, and the cycle continues and it never really gets out of that person's particular space. Nobody else contributes to it. We all have an opportunity actually to contribute to that if we are encountered with it on demand. Then the other one, seek to understand before solving. This gets really at kind of, we call it in Excalibur, the tendency to solution an idea or an issue before really understanding what we're aiming for. And so the same thing can really be applied when we are interacting with users and they are telling us about the deficiency that they are experiencing. We want to be able to listen to what they have to say, document how they are saying and what they are saying, and make sure that we just totally understand the issue at hand before trying to create some sort of solution for it. And we need to keep in mind that while we are listening to them and while we are interacting with them, that we are interacting with our knowledge base to a certain degree to understand whether we are encountering a new demand of knowledge or whether we are encountering a repetitive demand of knowledge that we might already have in the environment. Sufficiency is a big one. I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier with concentrating too much on how much content there is and how it looks and feels. KCS would support this idea of sufficiency. We don't have to create the Bugatti when we just need the Buick. And that will save us time and energy. And if we end up having to get down the road with, with a more comprehensive level of detail that's required to actually solve a problem or answer a question, then we get there when we get there, not trying to fill every hole in the road in one shot. Same thing with the design too. KCS is not espousing some sort of randomized way to organize the content. On the contrary, they have a very logical way of breaking up the distinct pieces of a knowledge article, not really so different than maybe even some standard ways that we would think about that by default. But they are, I think they're working in a much more, the methodology is much more controlled in terms of the design. And of course, if you have technology that supports that design, or if you have technology rather that is more supportive of the KCS methodology, then you don't really have to worry so much about the design there because some of that is kind of built in. And then finally, the integration. We are working to integrate how we handle knowledge with the other work that we do. This is not some other path that we follow at 5:01 p.m. After a whole day of interacting with people. We're doing the work within the day-to-day workflow that we do now. And then finally here, the practices and techniques. So these are the places where we're definitely going to get into more detail in subsequent sessions. But the core KCS practices are based in these closed work loops. And so these really serve as the practical operational way that the process gets accomplished. And if you think of a Venn diagram, okay, where you have two circles with a portion in the middle that overlaps, that is a very good description of what this would look like visually. And so that's divided into these two different loop practices. One is called the solve loop, and the other one is called the evolve loop. All right. When we're in the solve loop, this is really the more transactional space. Okay, this is kind of the day in, day out, front end workload that we have, and it's divided into several techniques, including how we capture what's being requested of us and documenting that in a particular way, how we structure it, how we reuse content that's already there, and how do we improve upon the content that already exists. The evolve loop is the more reflective side. It is the continuous service improvement. And so the people that are involved with the evolve side of things are concerned with the integrity and maturity of the process as it exists in our environment. They are concerned with content health. They're concerned with how the solve loop is working, okay, for the organization, and in that, how the individuals that are playing the roles within the solve loop are performing. And then they are also tasked with being the primary point of leadership and communication around the KCS methodology and the practice as it continues to evolve and mature in the organization.
And so many of you that are on the line with us probably are doing the same thing I know I was doing when we started to learn about KCS, where you go, whoa, this is kind of taking what we know as knowledge and have known as knowledge for all of our careers up to this point, and we're taking it and we're turning it upside down. It's not about making articles perfect. It's not about having these multi-level review processes to cull articles and have them rewritten in a certain way. It's so different, but at the same time, we're already doing many of these steps. We're already taking many of these actions. We're just going to now do them in a different way. One of the core concepts that I take away, and we'll dive into these deeper in the subsequent sessions, but one of the core concepts was collecting and documenting the knowledge article in the context of the customer. So what does the customer describe the problem as? What do they describe as some of the symptoms of the problem? What were your troubleshooting steps for that? And that becomes that capturing. And so it's not about us, so often what we would do today in a more traditional knowledge structure is we would say, okay, well, they said it was this, so we're going to write the article this way because it had, they said it had to do with Outlook, but it actually wasn't an Outlook issue. It was something internal to core Microsoft Office component. Well, what really blew my mind once I kind of wrapped my head around this KCS principle, what's the next person going to call for, if you're looking at it from a call perspective, or search for in a knowledge management system? And how are they going to describe their problem? Outlook's what's giving them the error, or Microsoft Word's giving them the error. They don't know that it's internal. We do as IT folks because we troubleshoot the problem and we write the article in that sense. But it's how are they going to describe the issue? And they're, as a result, going to be more easily able to find the knowledge. And then also the concept of reusing those articles because it still is appropriate. we might be improving it. Maybe somebody else gave us a couple of other symptoms. And so that article starts to expand to say, hey, here are the things you may see. Here are symptoms that may help you diagnose that you're having this issue. And then here's how you go through and resolve it. But it's taking concepts that we already do, expanding them, but kind of tipping them over, and doing this in a very, very different way. It's so exciting because we've worked with customers and we've seen them leverage these concepts. We recently did a panel with some KCS experts that are using this within their organizations, and the speed at which they've been able to build their knowledge systems, the speed at which they've been able to build those articles, right? The key, the core content was very rapidly, because we're not going through an endless array of approval processes. It's about capturing the knowledge, capturing the issues, and then getting that information available so it can be found, it can be used, and it can be improved. And until it gets to a point where there's really nothing to add to that article. So it is one of those things where when you first kind of start to take this in, it's like, wow, this is so different. And then there comes that organizational change or personal change challenge of, okay, you're asking me to do something I've been doing one way, in my case, we'll just say for greater than 20 years, and do it very differently. And what seems like kind of in a more cavalier way. But when you start to see the impact that this has and the benefits that it provides, it's like, how can we waited so long to do this? Any final thoughts, Jonathan, before we get to questions?
No, I think that was a good summary. I think that was a good thought to add.
So we're gonna open the floor to questions. You can put your question in the question section within your GoToWebinar panel. I know Tabitha's kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said we have already a couple of initial questions. Tabitha, you want to throw the first one out to us?
Yeah, so I think this might have come from someone that answered that they just knew how to spell KCS in the beginning, but they haven't heard of KCS until now. Is this a new idea?
So Jonathan, you want to field that one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, no, it's not new. It might feel like it's new, but the Consortium for Service Innovation has actually been working on this for the better part of the last 20 years. And I think that some of my comments around where the knowledge process kind of historically has been housed from a framework perspective is probably one of the driving factors of why that KCS has come about to help try to fill in those holes from kind of a continuous service improvement perspective, but also a transactional process improvement space.
And you think back, Jonathan, okay, wow, it's been around that long, almost as long as really ITIL has, because ITIL's not, it's just an older cousin at that point. Why didn't it come in? And I think one of the driving factors of that is for the longest time, as I've grown up in IT, things are very process oriented, right? And while KCS has a process, it's a process that encourages a more free-form interaction, where processes as we grew up were a lot more structured. And so knowledge practices as a result kind of took on that more, I think as you put it earlier in the presentation, a more bureaucratic structure. And what we're seeing now is we're being asked as providers of IT services to our businesses to be less reactive, more proactive, more able to more quickly engage for things. And you look at the internet, right? The internet talking to my kids as they were getting ready for college. I got one more to get in there. I've got 2 through college already, And well, as we were getting ready, when many of us, us old timers, were getting ready for college, we didn't have an internet, right? You had a library, and you had books and things that you went through in order to identify colleges and figure out applications. And technology has very rapidly evolved, and you start to look at what are the expectations of the customers that are out there today, and KCS plays right into that. It's about very rapidly making knowledge available. You think of how quickly you want an answer from an Amazon or from Dell or from HP on a particular issue. It's taking that concept that many of them have gone into and have been into for multiple years now, of community sites and other things where folks like you and I are answering other people's questions because we run into the problem. And that starts to get culminated into a knowledge base as well, where, hey, here's what people are seeing, here's what's happening. And so it's become something very top of mind now to a lot of folks to say, hey, knowledge is one area where we're weak. If you go into our IT service management system self-service portal, you can ask for stuff. We don't have a lot to offer folks. And I look at the employees that you're bringing on now, which are those first those kind of the older millennials. As I think about it, right, their first instinct is not to call a service desk. It's to go to some sort of web page and see if they can answer the question themselves and self-serve. And so we need to have that information out there. But how do you get it out there quickly if our process takes months for an article to be published versus literally hours? And so this shift makes it much easier to get that information out there and make it available.
Yeah, we've had a lot of technology opportunities as well that foster exactly what you're talking about. Wouldn't necessarily support, right, the idea of like, well, we have this technology solution, now we need some sort of problem to solve. But in some cases we do have where just the technology that's come about, not even necessarily directly related to IT, but can foster this kind of more, this different degree of collaboration that we haven't seen. But that said, I wouldn't say that, it's no accident that like ITIL, as an example, the fact that it was sourced from a government agency in the first place, it brought about many really great things, but it also brought with it some of its sort of natural rigidity. I think in the beginning, set a particular tone for things, and we can take advantage of still maintaining the sort of the spirit of those processes, but using some different ways of thinking about them.
Thank you.
Tab, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, so I'll ask one more, and then Mike, I'll have you close us out on our presentation today. But a question came in that if you're taking on a KCS initiative after spending a lot of time compiling knowledge a different way, what happens to all the existing content?
Yeah, so that's probably one of the bigger questions that arises out of this. That is something that we're going to talk about in subsequent sessions. KCS is going to support the idea that you would archive your existing content. Now, they're not saying get rid of it, but they are supportive of the idea that you're going to start with a mostly clean slate, or a clean slate, because we are going to be changing the way that knowledge is going to come into existence in the first place. So if we do encounter, from a demand point of view, that content that we've already gathered has some value to speak into that, then we can go grab that content from our legacy space and make it part of what we're currently doing. But we are relying on the demand to drive that, not our own personal feelings about the content that's already been created. That is a big piece for I think, for organizations to wrestle with, especially when they feel like they've invested a lot of time and energy into any number of previously compiled knowledge articles.
All right, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Please mark your calendars, sign up early, sign up often, sign up twice on Sunday to join us on December 3rd at 1 o'clock Eastern Time for the second episode of the KCS series, KCS Overview and Principles. Additional details on that, as well as the subsequent sessions, are available at www.excaliburdata.com/upcoming events. And you can also register there. We thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and we look forward to seeing you again on another Excalibur presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.